Since I was little, I have always been a dedicated student. I took pride in being the one who never missed classes and always had the best grades in the class. However, that week, there was a particularly difficult math test that required all my attention. Since the time during classes seemed insufficient, I decided to stay at school after hours. The library, with its neatly arranged shelves and an almost sacred silence, was the perfect place. With my notebook open and pencil in hand, I immersed myself in the calculations as the sun set on the horizon. However, the intense routine of the day began to weigh on me, and before I knew it, fatigue overcame me. I dozed off over the books, letting the welcoming silence of the library envelop me. When I woke up, I was overcome by a strange sense of disorientation. Everything around me was shrouded in a darkness that felt dense and oppressive. Instinctively, I reached for my phone, but it was dead. Through the window, there was no sign of movement. The outside lights were off, and what had once been a peaceful silence now seemed threatening, as if the world outside had stopped. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly got up and walked to the main door of the library, only to discover it was locked. Strangely, I didn't remember anyone closing it. I tried to knock and call for help, but the echo of my words seemed to die in the emptiness. The only visible exit was a small window that led to the hallway. I pushed with all my might, managing to open a narrow passage and slip through it. On the other side, the hallway was bathed in dim light, illuminated only by a flickering emergency light. Every step I took seemed amplified, echoing off the walls like a reminder of the crushing solitude that surrounded me. An inexplicable coldness took over me, and the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. My heart raced as I continued forward, trying to ignore the instinct that screamed for me to turn back, even though I knew staying behind was not an option. Something impossible and terrifying happened in the next instant. At the end of the hallway, the bulletin board began to sway slowly and steadily, as if invisible hands were pushing it. The air was still. There was no wind, no one in sight. My breath became heavy and my feet hesitated, but something forced me to approach. When I got closer, I noticed that the papers that were once pinned were torn, hanging in uneven strips. Among them, a grotesque message caught my attention. Red words, written with something thick and shiny that looked like blood, formed the phrase, "You shouldn't be here." My legs wobbled and my eyes filled with tears that burned my face. A primal panic overtook me, and without thinking twice, I ran toward the stairs, hoping to escape that nightmare. But something was wrong. The staircase, which should have been a simple and quick route, seemed to transform before my eyes. With each step I took, the path seemed to stretch out, as if the building were alive and determined to trap me. The surroundings around me elongated, distorted, while the muffled sound of my steps echoed in the emptiness. I ran, but never reached the next floor. The feeling of being watched, now overwhelming, seemed to take shape when I heard footsteps behind me. They weren't ordinary steps. They were dragged, heavy, as if someone were pulling chains or something even darker. My heart raced and my feet hesitated for a moment, but driven by fear, I turned to face what was following me. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood out in the dim light. Tall and thin, it seemed almost inhuman, with sharp contours and a face hidden in the shadows. However, something was impossible to ignore. Its eyes glowed like embers, piercing my soul with a fixed and threatening gaze. Before I could react, a hoarse and cold voice cut through the silence. "You slept here. Now you belong to this place." It was a whisper that seemed to come from all directions, though the figure in front of me remained still. My legs trembled, and my body seemed frozen, unable to obey my mind's desperate commands to run. When I finally managed to move, I turned and continued down the stairs, even though they seemed endless, my mind spinning between fear and the urgency to survive. Finally, my feet touched the ground floor, but something was terribly wrong. The environment that had once been familiar now seemed straight out of a nightmare. The cafeteria, which should have been empty and organized, was completely overturned. Stacked chairs formed absurd structures, almost like grotesque sculptures defying gravity. A dense and oppressive mist covered the floor, rising up to my ankles, while the walls were marked with countless handprints. Some were small, like those of children, but others were large and misshapen, with elongated fingers that didn't seem human. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. Something was following me, I was sure of it. I ran desperately toward the main exit, my only hope of escaping. I pushed the door with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. My desperation grew, and between sobs, I began to murmur, "It's just a dream. It has to be just a dream. I will wake up." The sudden silence was even more terrifying than the previous chaos. I felt the air around me grow cold, almost as if it were being sucked in by an invisible presence. Something was there, behind me, so close that it seemed to whisper in my ear. I slowly turned around, but there was no one. Only the emptiness stared back at me. It was then that a shrill, cold, and malicious laugh echoed through the hallways. The sound seemed to come from all directions, filling the space with a paralyzing energy. I shut my eyes tightly, my hands covering my ears, and screamed in an attempt to drown out the madness around me. When I finally opened my eyes, everything had changed. I was back in the library. The sunlight was starting to come through the window, bringing a normalcy that seemed almost impossible after what I had just experienced. I gathered my things with trembling hands and ran out of the school, promising myself that I would never stay late there again. The world outside seemed intact, but inside me the fear lingered, throbbing like an open wound. As I passed by the bulletin board on my way out, a strange feeling made me look at it again. There it was, a phrase written perfectly, in letters that hadn't been there before. "See you next time." My heart raced, and my feet didn't stop until I was far away from there. Since then, I've always avoided being alone anywhere for too long, but the thought of that phrase still haunts me. Was it a dream, or just the beginning of something much darker? I never believed in ghost stories. I always saw these narratives as exaggerations created to impress or scare, something far from reality. However, that night in the gym completely changed my perspective. At the time, I was part of the school basketball team, and with the championship approaching, I decided to practice alone to improve my shots. During the day, the gym was a vibrant place, full of voices and contagious energy, but at night, it transformed into a completely different space. Silence took over, and the sound of my footsteps and the bouncing ball echoed in a disturbing way. On that Friday, with the court empty and the atmosphere surrounded by a strange air, I prepared for another night of practice, unaware of what was to come. At first, everything seemed normal, but then the signs began. While I was in the center of the court, I felt an unexpected chill run down my spine, something I attributed to exhaustion. I focused on my shots, but a different sound caught my attention. Footsteps. They were light, yet clear, coming from different directions. My body froze for a moment as my eyes scanned the gym for any movement. There was no one there. It must be in my head, I thought, trying to stay calm. But then, suddenly, something broke the silence completely. The ball, which had been still beside me, began to roll on its own toward the corner of the court. The movement was slow and precise, as if it were being guided by invisible hands. I was paralyzed, unable to react. My heart seemed to be in my throat as I tried to find a logical explanation for what I had just witnessed. There was no wind, nor any slope in the floor that could justify what had happened. The gym, once just an empty space, now seemed alive, but not in a way I understood. I tried to convince myself it was all just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Each second that passed increased my urge to run away, but my legs wouldn't move. That night, marked by a disturbing stillness and inexplicable events, was the moment I realized that some stories are not just tales to scare. Sometimes, the inexplicable finds us when we least expect it. I tried to ignore the discomfort and kept playing, forcing myself to focus on my shots. However, with each attempt, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, becoming almost unbearable. I decided to take a break and sat on the bench by the side of the court, trying to catch my breath and regain control of my mind. It was then that something inexplicable happened. At the back of the gym, where the lighting was dimmer and shadows danced on the walls, I noticed an unmoving figure. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, and with a cold shiver, I realized it was a boy. He was wearing what seemed to be an old-school uniform, completely dirty and torn, as if it had been forgotten in time. His eyes were fixed on me, so penetrating that it felt as if he could see my soul. I blinked several times, hoping it was just an illusion caused by fatigue, but he was still there, motionless, like a living shadow. As my mind struggled to understand what I was seeing, the figure slowly began to move toward me. His steps echoed through the gym, each one heavier than the last, and the air around me seemed to grow denser, almost suffocating. My body froze, unable to react, and as he got closer, his face became more visible. The boy had no eyes, just dark, empty cavities that conveyed something beyond fear, a deep despair. When he finally stopped a few meters away from me, he opened his mouth, but no sound came out. It was as if he was trying to communicate in a way that went beyond words. Somehow, I understood what he was trying to convey. He had gone through something terrible in that place and was trapped, unable to find peace. My mind spun, searching for an escape, but my only reaction was to apologize. I murmured, almost in tears, that I didn't want to disturb him, that I didn't know what had happened. To my surprise, the boy stopped his advance. He stood still, motionless, and slowly raised one arm to point toward the ground, exactly where I was sitting. My heart raced as I looked at the spot he indicated. Something in that gesture carried a dark intensity, as if that specific point held the key to a long-buried secret. It was at that moment that I realized the gym, seemingly empty, was hiding memories that time hadn't been able to erase. I didn't know what was to come, but one thing was certain. I was involved in something far beyond what I could comprehend. Suddenly, I was overwhelmed by an unbearable pain in my head, as if something was being ripped out from inside me or pushed in brutally. I closed my eyes, and in a whirlwind of confusing images, flashes of memories flooded my mind. They weren't mine. I saw a packed gym, a tense game, shouts, and then a fight. The next vision was quick, but painfully clear. The boy in the old uniform falling to the ground, his head striking the court with a fatal impact. The sense of despair and injustice emanating from those memories was overwhelming. When I regained my senses, I realized I was back in the gym. The spirit was farther away now, but his empty eyes were still fixed on me, filled with a sorrow that seemed endless. He wanted something, but I couldn't understand what. Fear took over me, and without thinking twice, I ran out of the gym, not daring to look back. The night, once calm, now felt suffocating, and every shadow seemed to follow me in my hurried escape. After that night, I swore I would never train alone again, especially at night. Still shaken, I started searching for answers about what I had witnessed. It didn't take long before I discovered that the visions that had invaded my mind were indeed connected to a real tragedy. The boy's name was Lucas, a promising player who had died years ago, right there on that court. The circumstances of his death were murky and shrouded in rumors. Some said he was pushed during a heated fight, while others claimed it was all just a terrible accident. But regardless of the truth, one thing was certain. His presence still haunted the gym, as if he were trapped, seeking justice or perhaps just a way to ease the pain that consumed him. To this day, the gym has never seemed the same to me. Whenever I pass by, I feel that same chill, a silent warning that something dark still resides in that place. Sometimes, when the silence of the night takes over the space, I hear footsteps echoing on the court, even though I know no one is there. Perhaps they are echoes of the past, memories that refuse to fade, or perhaps it's Lucas, still waiting for someone to understand his story. Whatever happened to him on that fateful night, it left a mark, not only on the court, but on everyone who dares cross its path. As for me, I will never forget that empty gaze and the weight of his pain, which remains alive like a shadow that never disappears.